Howdy. Second video, chapter 25, our topic is privacy. However, I'm going to leave some of these slides in, but I really want this lecture to be more about the General Data Protection Regulation. So the privacy laws in the United States are changing. Just recently, California passed a law that is now the most sophisticated law, should we say, for protecting the privacy of individuals. This is a changing landscape. So we're not going to get into all these nuances. We know about identity theft. The states are trying to catch up. We're going to talk about PCI DSS just in that. It's not a law. It's a contractual regulation. Talked about this in a previous one. And it was passed where the industry stood up and said, hey, we're the ones getting hit. When there's data breaches, we're the ones that are paying for new credit cards. We're the ones, our reputations are taking a hit. So it's a self-regulation, and it works very well. There's laws like the Fair Credit Reporting Act that you can find out if you're denied credit, why. Also have access to your credit summaries and the like. The Fair and Accurate Credit Transaction Act. All of these have to do with privacy. But frankly, as I've said before, privacy is the tipping point, and we are seeing new laws emerge. Anytime you're on a job, or you get a job, or you're being employed, you need to know what the current law is. We don't care about the history. What's the current law and what governs you? Okay? So while it is true that there's these concerns and the states have laws, go back to one of my first slides where I showed a map of the United States and the different jurisdictions. Depends on where you're going to be, unless it's a federal law. Now, Europe is ahead of us in some ways in protecting privacy. So the point here Dr. Conkle makes is the primary path is via opt-out in the US. Just by default, you're in. In Europe, it's opt-in. So without spending a lot of time going through these slides, but leaving them here in case you want to go through them, I want to get to GDPR. So they're in the courses. If you see them go by, great. The safe harbor, this mechanism, but this all changed on May 25th of 2018, just about this time this class was started, when GDPR. Now, today is July 27th, 2018, so it's been in fact 2 months. There's been hundreds, if not thousands, of claims already brought against companies. When I talk about privacy being the tipping point, yesterday I think the value of Facebook fell 19%. Based on lowered earnings expectation. It's always about the money, but related to their problems with privacy and possibly a non-working long-term monetization strategy. Let's talk about GDPR. So the Privacy Safe Harbor was retracted by Privacy Shield, and the Privacy Shield basically said, if you can self-regulate, and this was actually coordinated through the Department of Commerce, and you can tell us you're all safe and everything, we're good. Before this, the safe harbor was if you are a EU company operating in the US, okay? Now, along came Edward Snowden, and Edward Snowden is not a hero of mine. I go back to his interview in Wired magazine where on the cover he was wrapped in the American flag, and I find him either totally naive or one of the best spies of this century for getting into Russia, where he's now basically caught. Any country that did not think we were spying on them and that they spy on us, to me it was being naive. It's just that it was exposed. And so this upset the Europeans that we knew what Angela Merkel was talking about on her cell phone. And, maybe rightfully so, but do we really believe we don't have agents working here? But the whole notion of privacy in GDPR goes back to what happened in World War II. And as a result, the Europeans have just a different outlook. As I've said before, our notion of privacy comes from a law journal article and some court decisions that the Supreme Court could rule tomorrow and retract some of that. But what happened is Germany used public records to target certain groups. And so from 1933 to 1945, throughout most of Europe, the Germans made use of what was later incurred to be, privacy invasions. So the Europeans, if I had to put it fundamentally, I would say Europeans view privacy as a fundamental human right. And quite frankly, in the United States, we talk about human rights, we talk about civil rights, we talk about civil liberties, each of which is different. If we would say privacy is a fundamental human right, I don't think that's a concept we've really thought through. It's not that we don't think it, or we don't agree, or we agree. It's just that we've never looked at privacy like that. If this were an in-class, I would say something like, how many people here think to be safe is a human right? Hands go up. To not be civilians, not to be at the mercy of military groups, fundamental human right, yes. To the right to education, yes. The right to clean water, yes. All these fundamental human rights, basically rights that every single human being on the planet is due. If I say how many of you think of education, the right to education, hands go up. If I say the right to free education, typically American hands go down, international student hands stay up. It's a fundamental difference. My point being, not if free education is right or wrong, but it's a fundamental difference in our cultures, what we view as human rights. And we just haven't thought about privacy being a human right. So here's what GDPR changed. It applies to processing of data. Now, some commentators say the data has to be in the EU. Other commentators say no, the law applies to the private data of an EU citizen or resident of an EU country, wherever they are. However, the courts are going to work out, if you have a website and you're selling something and there's a German in his hotel room and he runs a charge card that goes on a German bank, are you going to want to have to figure out how different regimes for data protection? So we should look at GDPR and say, these are some good ideas. How can we implement the protection devices? The penalties are huge, 4% of gross national sales, international sales, or 20 million euros, whichever is larger. So if you're a small company, 20 million euros can be a big hit on the pocketbook. There must be explicit consent before there's cookies every single step of the way. You must explicitly ask this data subject, which is what GDPR calls human beings, data subjects, for consent. And then those data subjects have certain rights. Breach notification within 72 hours. So within 72 hours that you have reason to believe that there was a breach, data breach, you have to notify not only a government agency, but the victims. A second right is the right to access, your full right to access your data. So you think, well, yeah, that sounds good. Okay, Facebook, tell me everything you've been tracking on me. Okay, Google, tell me everything you've been tracking on me. We tend to think the right to access data is like our right to medical history and the right to certain government records. Enlarge the scope of that. The right to data is, the right to access means the right to find out all the metadata, the data analytics, and everything that's associated with that data. I was just very disappointed to read the news yesterday that 23andMe has sold my data. I got to go in and double check my privacy settings. I've also been recently contacted by someone who was adopted and has we share common great-grandparents, and he wanted me to help find his birth family because my DNA data was out there. And I was with 23andMe, if you know the history of the company, way back when it started. They gave me DNA analysis that they can no longer give under the FDA. But my point is the right to access that data. I want to know now, hey, it's not just that you have my DNA data. You've told me this. I know this. I want to know the right to access what you've done with that data. So the right to be forgotten. I don't like the fact that you're storing this data. So get rid of it. Data portability, the ability to take data with you when you go, right? Privacy by design. Now think about if you're a software developer. You're designing a system, how many times do you say at the very part of the design, let's put in our privacy controls? In legacy systems, there is going to be an afterthought. And the last one is of companies of a certain size have to appoint a person within the company with the proper credentials for data protection officers, DPO. Again, I think the threshold is 250 people. If you're an IT company or you're a technology company, no big deal. If you're a manufacturing company with a very slim IT staff, having this data protection officer as your key person in data breaches and having them certified becomes burdensome. So GDPR defines, this is a definition of personal data, one that can be identified directly or indirectly, reference to an identifier, identification number, location data, But look at the last three lines. Or one or more specific factors specific to the physical, physiological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social identity of that natural person. Do me a favor. When you figure out exactly what that means, clue me in, okay? The key question is, can you identify that person by the data? Can I take biometric markers of you and uniquely identify you? Can I identify you based on characteristics about your economic, cultural, or social identity? So that's a big issue. What is personal data? Second big issue is there's a disagreement on the scope of jurisdiction, so we're going to watch this play out in courts, and there haven't been any court decisions yet. Third issue is there's definitely the EU. Okay, there's 28 countries, I think, at this time. Then there's what's called the EUA, those countries that were never in the EU, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, but by treaty interact with the EU. Then you have Canada and Mexico on our borders that are implementing GDPR-like legislation. South American countries that have, Singapore already has, and lastly, you have this New York law on financial institutions and vendors that was, I think, passed in 2017, not 2018, that is very GDPR-like. So going through this, there's two types of companies. Do you control the data or do you process the data? So I control the data. I'm keeping all this data, but I hire you as the processor. Well, guess what? We're both responsible. You can't say, hey, I'm just here processing the data. I got my server farm. I do this or that. You're responsible. I can't say, look, I manufacture plumbing supplies, and so I contract out my processing. Still responsible. You cannot get away from responsibility, whether you're a controller or a processor. Now, you have different obligations under each of these. However, you cannot get away from the restrictions of GDPR. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm not going to talk too much about these Canadian laws and everything that's in your slides for one basic reason. If they implement GDPR, it's all over. All right, we've got one more video and then we're finished for the textbook. Stay with me.